Okay, so me again. We're going to very quickly look over Act 1, Scene 2. And the reason we're looking at Act 1, Scene 2, or the short section of Act 1, Scene 2, is because it's not aggressive at all. So actually, the language that Capulet used to describe Juliet, he describes her as vulnerable and delicate, is very different to the languages he uses to describe her later on in the play. And it's this change in language which signals the strength of his aggression later on. Basically then, in Act 1, Scene 2, Capulet seems a little bit fed up and is explaining to Paris, who's obviously come to find out if he can marry Juliet, about the feud that's been taking place. And he's explaining how Montague is bound by the same laws. He says he's bound as well as I. However, I think it's here where Capulet shows he does have a caring, more compassionate side. He says, "'Tis not hard, I think, for men as old as we to keep the peace." And I think here, Capulet's really explaining how he's had enough of the feud, he's had enough of the violence. He's saying he's old, he's had enough, and really, for two families that are so powerful, they should really be able to get on. That nobody says they have to love each other, but they really should just be able to get on without fighting in the streets and encouraging the younger people in their families to fight as well. However, it may not be that the older people who are forcing the young people to fight. He's old and he thinks he's had enough of the feud, so this might suggest it's the younger characters like Tybalt and Mercutio who are keeping the feud alive. Of course, Paris isn't going to disagree with his potential father-in-law, and he agrees. He says, "Of honourable reckoning are you both." So in other words, you are both equally as respected. You are both equally revered. And this sentence here reminds us particularly of a word or a phrase that was expressed in the prologue when Shakespeare claimed that the families were both alike in dignity. Now, I don't think this link, this echo to the prologue is there by accident. We're watching a scene in the play which appears very calm, it appears very nice. Paris is asking Capulet for Juliet's hand in marriage, and it's this reminder of the prologue which reminds the audience of their expectation. We know we're watching a tragedy. We also know we're watching a tragedy called Romeo and Juliet, not Paris and Juliet. So it's this link back to the prologue which reminds us that we're going to see something on stage which is going to be very sad and very tragic and very hostile. Of course, Paris isn't going to let Capulet get away without asking the question he really came for, and he says, "What say you to my suit? Will you let me marry Juliet?" And Capulet's answer simply is no. He says that my child is yet a stranger to the world, and you can see that bit there where I've underlined it. Basically, Capulet thinks his daughter is vulnerable. He thinks she's not old enough. He, in this sentence, is really showing his loving paternal side to himself. The part of himself which thinks a lot about Juliet, the part of him which wants to put her first and has her best intentions at heart. And then he says some very interesting phrases here. He says she's not old enough and that he should let 2 more summers wither in their pride, and then she will be ripe to be a bride. Now this is very interesting imagery here. Obviously summer's a time of great abundance of life, as is spring, but the idea that she will be ripe to be a bride gives us the impression that she will be ready to be a bride on the one hand, but also the idea of ripeness is something that can bear fruit. It can give birth by itself. So perhaps in 2 more years she will be ready to become a mother. This use of natural imagery and natural metaphors is very important, particularly when we're looking at the character of Lord Capulet, and it's very much used in the play to show moments of tenderness and moments in the play where he really cares about his daughter. It's very metaphorical and elevated, but I think as you read the rest of the play and as you explore patterns of language throughout the rest of the play, you want to particularly compare this use of natural imagery here to later on in the play when Juliet refuses to marry Paris, and look at the differences in the way that imagery is used, or whether indeed it is used. Paris, of course, has one last-ditch attempt to convince Capulet, saying that mothers are made that are younger than her, so people are given birth that is younger than she is, but Capulet's not interested. And it's here in this long speech, this long section, where Capulet really explains that all of his hopes for Juliet are about to happen, where all of his hopes for the future are pinned on Juliet. He suggests in this that Paris come to the party later on, where there are going to be many other women that he can perhaps have a look at and see really if he does fancy Juliet and love Juliet, or really if there was somebody more suitable out there for. Capulet seems to exaggerate a lot here, and he says that the earth has swallowed up all his hopes but her. He says the earth has swallowed all my hopes but she is the hopeful lady of my earth. And again, is this return to very natural imagery about the earth, but it's also quite apocalyptic. It seems very exaggerated. Why would the earth have swallowed up all of his hopes? Okay, he's involved in a feud, but Tybalt's not dead yet. We know that the family is still okay, so why is the earth swallowed up his hopes? But again, we know that this shows us very clearly that Juliet is very, very important to him. His future happiness depends on her, and she, of course, means the world to him. What's also important is that Capulet says his permission for Paris to marry Juliet isn't enough. He says, my will to her consent is but a part. So it's not enough for him to say yes. She must agree within her scope of choice. So unless Juliet agrees to marry Paris, Capulet won't allow it to happen. And like I said, he also reminded Paris to go to the party later on, where there will be fresh female buds, linking back, of course, to the idea that he explained that Juliet wasn't ripe, and where at this party where there's these other ladies, Paris might indeed find somebody who is more appropriate for him, and obviously forget about Juliet. Again, this would seem to make a lot more sense, as we know it's called Romeo and Juliet, not Paris and Juliet. The other important thing to notice about this section is that the style changes. So the initial part of this section was in blank verse, whereas this bit becomes rhymed verse, and that's not much different. It will still be in iambic pentameter, but you'll notice that the words at the end of the lines rhyme. So heart rhymes with part and choice rhymes with voice, and if you look back you'll realise that pattern continues. Now some would say obviously that it makes it more elevated, but what it does do is it shows us clearly the difference between lines which are end stopped or lines that run on. It's called enjambment. And what this suggests is that if you look at each line makes something make sense on its own. So my will to her consent is but a part. That makes sense on its own. We don't need to read the next sentence for that to make sense. It makes sense purely by itself. But woo her gentle Paris, get her heart. That makes sense as well by itself. She must agree within her scope of choice. Makes sense. And in this way, in the way that we don't need to read line after line after line for the whole thing to make sense. There's no sense of urgency. It's more relaxed. It doesn't put any pressure on the characters in the scene. It makes the whole thing seem more gentle. And it's this, again, which reminds us later on in the play, when we look at the way Capulet's language changes, that he's moving from gentle and non-aggressive here to very aggressive later in the play. What's also very interesting is that rhymed verse is often used for moments in the play where advice is being given to the characters, or it's pointing to a moral, so where the characters are learning a lesson. And I think it's quite ironic here that Capulet is saying that Juliet needs to have choice and Juliet needs to be treated with respect, which is advice he later on doesn't follow. Perhaps the irony is, if he'd have followed his own advice that he was given to Paris at the beginning of the play, and she was allowed to marry who she wanted, she was given that scope of choice, the tragic events in the play would not have happened. To recap then, we've learnt that Capulet is past being angry. He's had enough of being angry. We know now that he wants to live in peace. We learn that Paris suggests that they're both honourable families, but again that this is very important, linking back to the prologue, reminding the audience that they're watching a very tragic play. Capulet suggests that marriage has to be Juliet's choice. Remember, his advice is ironic. He doesn't follow his advice. Perhaps if he had, the deaths of Romeo and Juliet wouldn't have happened. We've learned that naturalistic imagery is used to express tenderness, and I think it's important to look for the lack of naturalistic imagery later on in the play when he's showing his anger. And we've learnt that the controlled lines, particularly in the rhymed verse, where the N stopped, suggest a lack of urgency. So everything in this scene is calm and doesn't perhaps show any aggression at all, but makes a good comparison for later in the play.